Now, before we get into the text, I do think it's very important for us to provide a little bit of context, both biblically and historically, and in the process to do some myth-busting as well. Contrary to what is often taught and/or popular opinion, slavery wasn't just a problem in the early history of our country. Slavery has a worldwide history. I mention this because sadly, there are those, whether they be in pop culture, whether they be political pundits, whether they be in the Democratic Party or any political party, there are those who would like to seize upon the sinfulness of a certain portion of America's history as though it was isolated to America, when slavery and the barbarous slavery that has been practiced throughout human history. It's a sad reality that witnesses to human depravity. Slavery was a part of ancient Egypt. Slavery was a part of Old Testament Israel. Slavery was a part of ancient China, the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, ancient Greece, ancient India, ancient Rome. And if you were to go on and on, you would see that a vast amount of countries within the last 2,000 years have had some form of slavery within it, including up to Mali and Mauritania, which, though having recently abolished slavery formally, have still had some measure of slavery practiced in their country even into the 21st century. Sadly, the number of places where human trafficking and some form of slavery still exist are quite disturbing. Now, as it relates to the African slave trade, infamously associated with the early history of our country, many would be surprised to find, as the French historian Fernand Braudel wrote, quote, "Africa had already developed this bad habit," he's talking about trading slaves, "long before the Europeans arrived, sending slaves to Islam, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean." He continued saying, "Slavery was endemic in Africa, part of the structure of everyday life." For instance, on his Just Thinking podcast, Darrell Harrison quoted a portion of Dr. Walter Hawthorne's book, Planting Rice and Harvesting Slaves, Transformations Along the Guinea-Bissau Coast, in an episode dedicated to the subject of slavery reparations. And he noted how the Balanta, the largest ethnic group in Guinea-Bissau, conducted raids on other African groups for the purposes of exporting them and receiving valuable imports as a result, like iron. In like manner, people might be surprised to find that there was a wealthy aristocracy in Africa that profited mightily from the slave trade. Frederick Douglass, for instance, referred to the savage chiefs of the western coasts of Africa as those, quote, "who for ages have been accustomed to selling their captives into bondage and pocketing the ready cash for them." He went on to say, "We are therefore less inclined to go to Africa to work against the slave trade than to stay here to work against it." To give a glimpse, it's just a glimpse of the breadth of this practice within the continent of Africa, according to an article concerning Timbuktu on slaveryandremembrance.org, quote, "From 650 to 1600, nearly 5 million enslaved people from Sub-Saharan Africa were transported through Timbuktu and other desert trading centers for destinations along the Mediterranean Sea, Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean." And that little glimpse doesn't even begin to enumerate all that went on in previous centuries within the entirety of the continent. But so as to provide a little bit more context, as it relates to the transatlantic slave trade, Dr. Peter Hammond, in his book, Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam, The Historical Roots and Contemporary Threat, in just about the beginning of the book, he stated that about 95% of the approximately 11 million Africans that were transported across the Atlantic went to South and Central America, mainly to Portuguese, Spanish, and French possessions, with only about 5% making their way to the United States. Now, although the time frame is different, estimates range. Now, if you look at different resources, you'll see estimates range concerning how many Africans were brutally enslaved by Arabs/Muslims. The estimates range from at least 14 million, from what I've seen, to 28 million. And both figures do not include all of those who died in slave raids or never even made it to the quote-unquote marketplace. Now, why do I share all that? Because sadly, whether it comes from someone who is vying for political office or someone in the social justice movement, there are people in our culture who are seeking to fan the flames of social dissension by dredging up sins from the past as though they are the exclusive sins of white European settlers, when in reality, for instance, the African slave trade existed among different African ethnic groups, among Arabs, and existed for centuries prior to the first slave being brought to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. The wickedness that is associated with slavery in this country, note that, the wickedness that is associated with slavery in this country sadly has been practiced in various places, in various points at human history by many different cultures, and is a witness not just to the depravity of one people group, but is a witness to the depravity of man and the sinfulness of mankind. So whether it was the children of Israel who were under harsh bondage under Egyptian rule, or whether it was the approximately 1 million white European Christians, as they are often referred to, who were captured by Muslim pirates in between 1530 to 1780, whether it was the Transatlantic or the SubSaharan slave trade, barbarous slavery has been a blight not only on American history, but on human history. What is unique, however, is that while other cultures and countries have had slavery as a part of their culture for over 1,000 years, in our nation, thanks be to God, the history is comparatively short, about 250 years, with the abolition of slavery driven in large part by Christian abolitionists. And so again, I say to you, so as to protect you from being fanned by the flames, being fanned into flames by those in our culture, whether it is pundits, pop culture, or political candidates, those who look to America's past for the purposes of distributing present guilt, interestingly, they crop out the context of history for the purposes of inciting dissension and accruing power. In my opinion, attempting to weaponize people, making slaves of people for the purposes of achieving their own political, cultural, or just simply fleshly ends.